How do you know where to start a story? I've had to rewrite several narratives because I just didn't know whether I wanted one character's origins to be the main story or the backstory. And it's a fair question. Do you want to see new events unfolding as the character's thrown into an entirely foreign scenario, or do you want the mystery of a character's past to slowly unravel as they're dealing with the stuff that happened afterwards? I do admit I have a personal favorite out of these two, but I'll try to remain unbiased in my analysis, especially since both of them are pretty good. So, do you write the big thing in your character's life as a backstory, origin, or both? For that, let's delve into the plot. Origins are very popular, and for good reason too. They're clear, have a straightforward and understood motive that you see at the very beginning, and there's not a lot of confusion about why the protagonist is doing the things that they do. For the sake of this video, the origin story, and I'm applying this to all mediums in a very loose definition, is when the first inciting incident that spurs the rest of the story is the center of attention and happens in real time when the narrative takes place. This is usually what the first episode is when it's in a series. Sister turned into a demon? Origin. You turned into a demon? Origin. On that day, mankind received a grim reminder and you were orphaned by a titan, only to later find out that you yourself are a titan? Origin. Putting the origin as the main focus is an effective way of getting the audience immediately on board with whatever's happening. If something interesting happens in the first chapter, episode, or act, then you can see how the character will learn and adapt to that change. And you'll go on that journey alongside them rather than playing the detective and treating the character and their origin as more of a puzzle, which is a fun alternative that you get with a backstory. I think you can see the pattern here. The thing happens that's very different from the norm, character reacts and adapts. But isn't that what happens in every story? Well, if you've seen Fullmetal Alchemist, then not exactly. In that anime, and while the backstory is revealed a bit differently in the manga, the main two characters already went through their inciting incident before the story takes place. The first episode shows the general premise of what the characters are doing now, and shows, and well tells, the gist of why both characters are made of metal in some way. Only after establishing that that's their status quo does the second episode show their actual backstory and how they got that way, essentially by using alchemy in a way they're not supposed to so that they could revive their mom, costing an arm, a leg, and a brother. They show the backstory early so that we can understand the protagonist's goals, mentality, and motives going forward, especially because it seems like they haven't changed all that much as people apart from additional angst and a different understanding of human transmutation. And honestly, this is one of my favorite story structures. I like when characters are already dealing with the thing that happened to them because it makes them feel like they've been living a life before we started reading or watching. That's why this and Spy Family works so well. The characters were already doing stuff before whatever new threat or development caused the second inciting incident that we, the audience, see at the beginning of the show. Hell, even Avatar: The Last Airbender did this, the backstory being when Aang ran away, and the second when Katara and Sokka found him in the ice. But sometimes this can't work. There are certain plot points that will feel cheap or cliché if you don't give them the space and development that they need. In Arcane, for instance, Jinx would be far less interesting if we didn't get 3 initial episodes of her arc as Powder. The reason it had to work in such a linear way is because of the sense of progression that we get from the character arcs and the story as a whole. If not, the show wouldn't have been a tragedy and would have had to instead focus on some sort of redemption arc. It's the same for Xenoblade Chronicles 1. If we didn't get to know Fiora before her death and she was just some tragic backstory for Shulk, it would have had a lesser effect because we wouldn't have been as invested in the character. It also couldn't have taken place in Shulk's past because he would have already been halfway through the story by the time we started the game. When writing an origin or backstory, you need to consider what the characters have been doing in the time after their inciting incident. Going back to the other example, Arcane used a time skip to get from Jinx's origins to where she is now, and it works because we know why she's like this, just without any major plot points happening in between then and now. The reason the time skip takes us to right before Vi is let out of prison is because that's where the interesting part of the story starts. Likewise, if Fullmetal Alchemist had started at the inciting incident, the show would have had to take a major detour from its whole anti-imperialism plot and instead focus on Edward and Alphonse joining the military. From these examples, it's a bit clearer why the placement of origins versus backstories is so important. Unless you want to follow several character arcs for the protagonist, leaving their origins in the past can be the best way to have a more straightforward and compelling main arc for the story. Although you can still have investment in backstories that aren't shown right away, but you have to also consider what you're focusing on in the main narrative. Sometimes it is more useful or interesting to make a character's backstory the main focus. My friend and I have always thought that Dazai and Chuya's Mafia days would be far more interesting to watch than Atsushi's story in Bungo Stray Dogs. Although then it would rob the anime of the subtext and mystery behind those backstories. Although personally I still think it would have been worth it, but then essentially everything would have to change in the show. If the anime started halfway through Dazai's past, or maybe starting at Chuya's initial arc of joining the Port Mafia, we would have still had the mystery of how Dazai got to be the way that he is, but with a more dynamic and centralized storyline based around the Mafia. Now, I'm not saying that this would work. Dazai's past and how the Port Mafia and Armed Detective Agency interact with each other are like half of what makes the show interesting, but it is important to understand how drastically the placement of a backstory can change how the narrative plays out, going as far as even being able to change the genre like with the tragedy example from earlier. Before, I mentioned that I've faced this dilemma in my own writing. I'm still planning on publishing this, so I'm gonna try to be vague, but essentially I wasn't sure which of the two protagonists' stories I should focus on, because one would follow the tragedy of a fallen hero plotline, whereas the other would be dealing with the consequences of said fallen hero's actions. I thought that the first would be far more compelling and direct, but I also didn't want to let go of the mystery of this one girl's backstory. Although I actually ended up going with the second version because it tied in way better with the themes, and it had a far stronger parallel arc between the main character and the fallen hero. If I wasn't going to have this dark mirror character parallel, I would have been able to take the story in a few different directions, but adding a central thematic focus helped me to understand which character's story I was going to follow. And theme does play a vital role in how your story is portrayed. Inciting incidents are simply setups for what's going to happen, meaning that despite the theme usually being flipped partway through the story's runtime, the inciting incident has to convey what the narrative is going to center around. And this applies regardless of where the inciting incident is. Death Note is a good example because it shows the initial concept of, hey, wanna know what happens when somebody gets magical death abilities and has a god complex? Because that's what the rest of the show is about. Now, all of this isn't to say that the beginning of your story shouldn't have an inciting incident if the protagonist already has a backstory. A general rule I like to follow is that if the protagonist has already gone through or is dealing with the thing by the time the story starts, the inciting incident is just something that shows a slight difference in the pre-established norm that they have been living with since their backstory. For instance, if a character was cursed in their tragic backstory, the inciting incident would likely involve some sort of allusion to their curse, maybe by way of them needing to control it while in a small fight or argument. Once you establish how the protagonist's life has changed since their backstory, you can start the new arc of their story that expands upon what's happened to them in the past. There are so many aspects to consider in any category of writing. After all, each piece is linked together in some way, and you need to ensure that it stays cohesive, unlike this video's script. And with everything in writing, it depends. It'll depend on what you find most interesting. It'll depend on what best represents the theme. It'll depend on if you're a perfectionist who has to rewrite their story 50 times before realizing which version actually worked the best. I'm definitely not saying that from experience. Best one was the 5th draft, if you were curious. But anyway, with all of these options, how do you actually choose? Well, to summarize, first, write your story where the theme is the strongest. Second, keep the genre in mind, because certain genres will need quite a bit of reworking depending on where the initial inciting incident is. Third, think about what you want from the character arc. If you want the character to learn a belief in Season 1, learn the flaws of that belief in Season 2, become a tragic fallen hero in Season 3, and have a redemption arc in Season 4, well, good luck, but you may want to put the beginning arc in a backstory. Fourth, and most importantly, what aspect of the story do you find most interesting? You don't want to be stuck writing a story that you hate, so focus on the feel and dynamics that you're most excited to write. Well, that's all for now. Happy writing! So, sorry this video is late. I was gonna write this a while ago, because I already had it scripted out in a very chaotic other draft, but I didn't really know what to do with it until I started watching Fullmetal Alchemist again, because I had started reading the manga in high school, but I never really, finished it. And its implementation of theme is actually pretty interesting too, which I'll probably make a video about in the future, but I'll have to wait until I finish actually watching the show before I can do that. But in the meantime, what are your favorite and least favorite origins and backstories? Let me know in the comments. And with that, I'll see you later. Bye!